This episode of Yesterworld is sponsored by NordVPN. Go to nordvpn.com/yesterworld to save 75% off a 3-year plan, and use code Yesterworld for a free extra month. I finally have mixed with tuberculosis, the one, and now I'm off to revive Stitch's Great Escape. Not so fast, Stitch. That's my book, and now it's time to pay for your crimes.
Being as it's Christmas, you're allowed a visitor.
A visitor? Hey, little guy. I don't want to see you. You ruined my life. I know, but I'm here to help you. You're just gonna have to trust me, okay? Many people often ask me, why did I help Stitch? Well, I eventually realized maybe he just needed that book more than I did. It was time to try and let go, even though it meant losing something deep down I loved. Just like those who adored Magic Kingdom's Mr. Toad's Wild Ride, as despite its fascinating origins rooted deep within Disneyland history, it didn't matter how beloved the attraction was, or the noble efforts by those who tried to save it. In the end, they just had to let it go. But don't take my word for it. The history of Mr. Toad's Wild Ride begins with Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, as shortly after its release and incredible success, Disney was looking for another story to adapt into a feature-length animation. He was pitched the idea of adapting The Wind in the Willows, a children's book written in 1908, part of which tells a story about a reckless motorist named Mr. Toad. Walt Disney purchased the rights to the story in 1939, but the animated feature was shelved just 2 years later, as Disney wasn't happy with the quality of what had been produced. Sketches and storyboards of this abandoned version of Mr. Toad have surfaced over the years, but whether production got to the animation stage is unclear. However, in 1946, The Wind in the Willows was revived and reworked into a 25-minute short, and packaged alongside an adaptation of The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, becoming The Adventures of Ichabod and Mr. Toad.
A motor car? Gad, what have I been missing?
The film was released in 1949 to both critical and commercial success, but its legacy would continue to a new form of entertainment, as just a few years later, Walt Disney began developing his idea for a revolutionary new theme park. Now, in previous episodes, we've explored the original signature attractions of Fantasyland. Of the original 4, Pinocchio Square was eventually abandoned, but another would take its place, a dark ride based on Mr. Toad. Unlike the others, Mr. Toad would not focus on recreating specific scenes from the animation. Instead, it would be the excitement and chaos of recklessly driving through locations inspired by the movie and original book. Also, unlike the others, in which Imagineers had all sorts of ideas for ride vehicles, Mr. Toad's was incredibly simple and an obvious choice right from the very beginning: a motor car. In 1954, construction began on Mr. Toad, and alongside the other Fantasyland attractions was built at a very quick pace. Mr. Toad would also share the same show building as Peter Pan, as well as the original Mad Hatter gift shop. The show scenes for Mr. Toad were built and assembled at the Disney Studios in Burbank, California, most of which consisted of plywood flats. The studio was also the location where Imagineers assembled the vehicles, designed the track layout, and gave the vehicles a test drive. Once the show building was complete, the scenes were relocated and installed, and on June 17, 1955, Mr. Toad and Disneyland were officially open.
Mr. Disney's great picture Wind in the Willows inspires this ride, Mr. Toad, on a 1903 automobile, and believe me, this ride is the wildest of them all.
Much like the other Fantasyland rides, the exterior was initially designed to be much more elaborate, more than likely a recreation of Toad Hall, but due to budget constraints, the medieval fair theme was a substitute. Upon entering the attraction, you would be faced with a beautiful and intricate mural, showing many of the events from the animation and those present in the ride. After taking the driver or passenger seat of your individually named motor car, your journey officially began. Unlike Peter Pan and Snow White, the track design was far more chaotic, with near constant twists and turns to avoid crashing into set pieces. You first found yourself in Toad Hall, and as you drove through the library past statues, paintings, and a fireplace, you eventually crashed into a bookcase and entered a very dark room with cool air. From the darkness, you were immersed into an English countryside, and just as it seemed as if you were about to drive into a cabin, you swerved out of the way. As you continued your reckless driving, you passed through a town, almost colliding with the local antique shop. Within moments, you had your first encounter with the police, who shined his lights and blew his whistle for you to stop. Instead, you made a sharp turn onto a wharf, and by way of bumps on the ground and forced perspective, appeared to be heading towards the end of the pier. At the last second, another sharp turn takes you inside a warehouse, heading toward a pair of slightly ajar doors saying "This way out." A flat cutout of barrels swing at your vehicle at the last second, forcing you to swerve right into a brick wall. You again found yourself in the English countryside, only this time it was very foreboding. More police try to stop your reckless path of destruction, but you won't have any of it and continue past a sleepy railroad operator. Despite red lights and signs warning you to stop, you proceed into a tunnel. Surrounded in pitch darkness, you were suddenly blinded by the light of what appeared to be an oncoming train, and seemingly crashed into the locomotive. You then received a warm Disney welcome into the gates of heck, winding your way through the fiery corridors and laughing devils. Thankfully, you reach a crash shore and escape to civilization, as Imagineers didn't intend for visitors to feel as if they ended there for eternity.
To travel the road with Mr. Toad and experience his misadventures is something you'll never forget.
Compared to the other Fantasyland rides, one of the most successful parts of Mr. Toad was the whole taking on the role of the main character narrative. With Snow White and Peter Pan, and eventually Alice, many guests complained about not seeing their favorite character in their own attraction. They didn't understand that they were supposed to be experiencing the ride through the eyes of the story's main character. With Mr. Toad, guests intuitively understood, as they were literally driving his car as seen in the film. In 1961, many of the Fantasyland attractions saw minor updates, and while Peter Pan's was the most drastic, Mr. Toad would see quite a few as well. Toad Hall was extended into the dark, empty room before the English countryside, becoming a kitchen now featuring a butler. The town center was given a water fountain featuring Mr. Toad and his companion, and Ratty was placed outside one of the facades. The now iconic crash door barrels were added into the warehouse, and a few additional policemen popped up near the end. The scene in Heck was also given an upgrade, replacing the flat devils with three-dimensional rubber figures, and making the scene more detailed and elaborate overall. Mr. Toad's Wild Ride would go mostly unchanged for the next 20+ years, but another version was in the works for Disney's Florida theme park, the Magic Kingdom.
This room at the Walt Disney Studios is the command post for Project Florida.
When deciding the attractions of Magic Kingdom's Fantasyland, Peter Pan, Snow White, and It's a Small World were obvious choices, but Mr. Toad was up against 3 other possible experiences. An attraction based on Mary Poppins called Jolly Holiday, another on the Legend of Sleepy Hollow, and a ride based on Sleeping Beauty. Of course, all of these would have made excellent choices for dark rides, but Mr. Toad won the competition as it was more cost-effective. However, it would see the most amount of changes from the original Disneyland version compared to the others when the park opened in 1971.
Nearby is Mr. Toad's Wild Ride, based on the classic children's story, The Wind in the Willows.
Magic Kingdom's version of Mr. Toad featured 2 separate experiences, Track A on the left and Track B on the right, with a queue that was much more elaborate than its predecessor. Side by side with the other vehicle, both experiences began with entering Toad Hall, but we'll begin first with Track A on the left. As you drove through Toad Hall, you would soon have a near collision with those experiencing Track B. You then found yourself in Mr. Toad's trophy room. As you wound your way through the show scene, all of the visuals were along the wall, which made it one of the more empty scenes in the ride. You then crashed into the kitchen for a brief encounter with some of Mr. Toad's staff. From Toad Hall, you entered a forest with signs advertising a palm reader named Sarah, which led to a gypsy camp full of very colorful characters. Leaving the camp, you somehow wound up on a one-way street, and surprise surprise, you were driving in the wrong direction. This resulted in another very close call with visitors on Track B, and if timed correctly, you entered Town Square alongside the other vehicle. This was the largest room within the entire attraction, and you more or less saw exactly what the other visitors were saying. From Town Square, you entered Winky's Tavern with a very, risque portrait and rather busty waitress, as the owner threw mugs of beer spinning in the air. This led to a storage room where the weasels were hiding among the barrels, presumably waiting for the cops. A stack of barrels swing away as you enter the rain room, passing by Rowdy's house before almost colliding with a fisherman. Of course, you ignore the warning signs of a railroad crossing and enter a dark tunnel, where just like the original, you were struck by an oncoming train. You end up in the same fiery place as the Disneyland counterpart, only this time featuring Satan himself, but thankfully you escape back to civilization. However, before leaving to experience the park's other attractions, why not ride Mr. Toad again, only this time on Track B? After winding through Toad Hall, which on this side was far more intricate and detailed, you had a near collision with the vehicle on Track A. After crashing into a fireplace, you found yourself in the library of Toad Hall. In this room, you pass by McBadger, and after almost being struck by a suit of armor, you crash into a bookshelf. After a period of darkness, you arrive to a barnyard, almost running into various farm animals. After swerving past a very angry farmer, you crash into a barn, where chickens fly above you in circles as you continue your motor madness. Similar to Track A, you enter a one-way street going in the wrong direction, which of course resulted in the near collision with the vehicle on the other side. Town Square was of course identical, as it was the same room on the other side. However, you suddenly made a sharp turn into a court procession, where just like in the movie, you were on trial and found guilty of reckless driving. You travel through the jail cells where the gang of weasels are making their escape, and before long you're caught in the middle of a shootout between the police and weasels. Much like the other side and Disneyland Original, you drive toward a railroad crossing and enter a tunnel, and eventually are struck by an oncoming train. The location of Heck was virtually identical, as it was simply a mirror opposite, but thankfully you escape once again back to civilization.
And so when we speak of fabulous characters, the most fabulous of all will always be, to me at least, the Master of Toad Hall.
Magic Kingdom's version of Mr. Toad was the rare case of being a major improvement over the original, unlike a certain future and rushed Pirates of the Caribbean. However, back over at Disneyland in the 1980s, the original Mr. Toad was about to receive a massive update for the 1983 overhaul of New Fantasyland. Much like Snow White's Adventures, Mr. Toad's track layout and scenes were completely gutted to essentially rebuild the ride from scratch. To extend the ride's show scenes, both Peter Pan and Mr. Toad would utilize the old Mad Hatter's gift shop. With the extra space, a portion of Mr. Toad's show building would serve as a new finale for its neighbor, Alice in Wonderland. Like the others, Mr. Toad's outside and queue was given a drastic facelift and would finally see the recreation of Toad Hall as initially envisioned. And in May of 1983, New Fantasyland was open. Though for some reason, Mr. Toad never had any real visual coverage, at least compared to the other reimagined dark rides. One of the first apparent changes to the ride was taken from the Magic Kingdom, where you crash through a fireplace, only this time it used a smoke and projection effect. The rest was a perfect blend of updated scenes based on the original 1955 version, and a few inspired by both tracks of Magic Kingdom's version, such as Winky's Tavern and the judge sentencing Mr. Toad. This time, Imagineers used the likeness of the prosecutor from the animated film, who then appears as Satan himself. A bit dark, but also a humorous jab at the whole lawyer cliché.
Thank you! That is all!
In one of the earliest examples of an abandoned ride effect, by 1986 the fireplace illusion was replaced by a scream crash door, as the smoke wasn't having enough time to build in between vehicles passing through, making the projection often invisible. Speaking of abandoned, I'm sure you know where this story is headed, and actually begins with the collision gag in Magic Kingdom's Mr. Toad. Sort of.
Hello, I'm Michael Eisner. I'm here with Winnie the Pooh and Rabbit. We're making some snacks and getting ready to enjoy a special evening of cartoon classics on the Disney Sunday Movie.
You see, it was towards the end of Michael Eisner's time as president that cheap, fast, low maintenance cost, and high hourly load capacity became a huge priority. The whole gag of nearly colliding with the other vehicles, a pretty essential part of the overall experience, depended entirely on the ride operators sending both in at the same time. Since a priority was put on faster loading and unloading, the cars often ran through the gag either too early or too late for it to work. But the first true victim of the company's new priorities was 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, as it was a very expensive ride to maintain with a very low hourly load capacity. The attraction was suddenly closed without notice in September of 1994, supposedly for a quote, temporary maintenance period, but 2 years later, the closure was made permanent. Fans were understandably very upset with Disney, not only for closing a beloved attraction, but not giving them a chance to properly say goodbye. So as an effort to avoid this again, in late 1997, Disney announced the possible closure of Mr. Toad's Wild Ride in favor of a Winnie the Pooh experience.
The wonderful thing about figures, it's figures are wonderful things. Their tops are made out of rubber, their bottoms are made out of springs.
You see, this was around the time that Disney was really emphasizing the Magic Kingdom as wholesome and politically correct. Though far from graphic, Mr. Toad did feature risque depictions of women, alcohol, and of course the devil and Satan in hell. I mean heck. And parents complained about it scaring children. Though clearly not the only factors in their wanting it gone, it played a significant part nonetheless. However, Disney's early announcement of a possible closure didn't go quite as planned, as immediately a campaign was launched to save the ride. But this was far from just a simple petition. Keep in mind, this was the very, very early days of the power of the internet, but even so, many fans from all over the country joined together in their anger to arrange protests of Mr. Toad's closure.
People like us who love the parks and go to parks continually, year after year, day after day, that has made them the success that they are. They're a repeat business. If they can keep both, fine. If not, I like Winnie the Pooh better than Mr. Toad.
Disney received thousands of letters, and the protests became so rampant that it was picked up by multiple news stations. Green t-shirts with the Save Mr. Toad slogan sold through the roof. There were even buttons, posters, patches, postcards, and other forms of merchandise to tell Disney how fans really felt. The situation became so severe that Disney put security on high alert, disguising them as janitors or even visitors, and stationing them both inside and outside of the attraction. Though to be fair, the protesters were very respectful to the staff and security, and was done more just as a precaution by Disney, as the groups met up in surprisingly high numbers month after month, day after day. Despite the efforts from devoted fans, on or around September 1st, 1998, members of the protest told news outlets that Disney had contacted them, revealing Mr. Toad would close on September 8th. As it turned out, they were mostly right, as just 2 days later, Disney made the official announcement that Mr. Toad would close on September 7th, giving unaware fans just 4 days to say goodbye. A bit ironic considering how the whole situation began in the first place. So just like that, one of Magic Kingdom's most beloved dark rides was gone, and in June of 1999, the many adventures of Winnie the Pooh opened to the public.
Ever have one of those days where you just can't win or...
Traces of Magic Kingdom's Mr. Toad are few and far between, though you can find a trophy bust at the Haunted Mansion and photographs within Winnie the Pooh and Owl's house. One is of Mole tipping the hat to Pooh, and another with Mr. Toad handing the deed to the show building, I guess. Curiously, Snow White's closure at the Magic Kingdom a little over 10 years later for a simple meet and greet drew very little attention beyond die-hard fans, making Mr. Toad quite the anomaly, especially given the internet's infancy. Of course, back over at Disneyland, the original Mr. Toad's Wild Ride is safe and sound. However, it is the only original Fantasyland dark ride that's yet to receive a single digital upgrade, so you might want to keep those Save Mr. Toad t-shirts handy. I'm only kidding, they wouldn't replace an original Fantasyland attraction, or would they?